Japan has been destroyed twice. It survived earthquakes, civil wars, the only atomic bombs ever used in a war, and the occasional giant lizard attack. It even survived 2 Mongol invasions. Over 4 million Japanese died along the way. How does a country come back from all that? And how does it stay so unmistakably Japanese? To understand how Japan survived all this, we have to go back to a queen nobody was ever allowed to see. Here's a map of Japan, way off to the east, all by itself in the Pacific. For around 10,000 years, people had been living on these islands. They were called the Jomon, and they made some of the oldest pottery ever found in the entire world. But what's strange is that for most of those 10,000 years, basically nobody wrote anything down about them. There's just silence. Even today, nobody knows for certain where the original Japanese people came from. Then, around 300 BC, a new group called the Yayoi showed up. They came from over here in Korea, bringing rice farming and bronze tools. They also brought a brand new concept called owning land. Now, here's the thing about rice farming. It can feed way more people than hunting and gathering ever could. So the Yayoi grew fast, having more babies and building more villages every year. The Yomun, who had been hunters and gatherers, just couldn't keep up. Slowly, they got pushed out and faded away. For the next few hundred years, Japan was a mess. Look at this map. It was full of hundreds of tiny tribes, all constantly fighting each other, and nobody could pull them together. Then, one of the weirdest leaders in history finally rose above them all. Her name was Queen Himiko, and she said she could talk to spirits. Honestly, imagine trying to run an entire country through only one guy. That sounds difficult enough. Running an entire fleet of warships sounds even worse. This video is sponsored by World of Warships. If you're interested in naval history, this game lets you command some of the most iconic warships ever built. From destroyers and cruisers to battleships, aircraft carriers, and submarines. You'll take part in large-scale naval battles inspired by real history. Right now, World of Warships is celebrating the 250th US anniversary event, running from June 17th through July 15th. During the event, you can earn historical rewards, unlock special content, and explore American naval heritage through new challenges and missions. New and returning players can use the invite code USA250 or the link in the description to receive rewards, including 1 million credits, 7 days premium, 500 doubloons, Stars and Stripes camouflage, the premium cruiser SS Albany, and the premium destroyer USS Smith. If you're interested in naval history, be sure to check out Naval Legends Cruisers, an upcoming book packed with detailed ship illustrations, battle maps, and stories from naval history. You can find the Kickstarter link in the description below. Thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring this video, and now, let's get back to the history. She had one very specific rule. Nobody was ever allowed to see her face. The only person who could even speak to her was her own brother. He delivered her orders to everybody else in the country. So, when Chinese envoys finally arrived from across the sea wanting to meet her, things got awkward.
I have traveled across the sea with gifts from the Great Wei Emperor. I'd like to meet your queen.
She cannot be seen.
But, how does she rule?
She rules through silence.
I have never heard of anything so stupid in my life! And yet, somehow, it worked. Himiko sent silk and slaves to China as gifts. The Wei Emperor was so impressed that he sent her back an official gold seal naming her friend and ally of the Wei dynasty. Being mysterious was apparently a real way to run a country. Then, Himiko died, and the moment she did, the whole country fell apart again. Her power had only ever come from how mysterious and magical she seemed. Once she was gone, all that magic was gone with her. The tribes had no reason to listen to anybody else, and they went straight back to fighting. Whoever rose next was going to need a completely different way to keep everyone in line. Something bigger than gold seals, something that made it dangerous to even think about disobeying. Out of all those warring tribes, one clan punched its way to the top. They were called the Yamato. To make absolutely sure nobody got any ideas about overthrowing them, they came up with a brilliant story. Their leader, they said, was descended directly from the sun goddess herself.
That made the emperor a literal god walking on Earth. Disobey him, and you are disobeying heaven. To prove their power, the Yamato started building tombs. Not normal tombs, enormous, keyhole-shaped tombs for their dead emperors. Look at this map. The biggest one, called Daisen Kofu, is bigger by area than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Most people have never heard of it. It's just sitting there in Japan today, pyramid-sized, mostly hidden under a forest. Then, trouble arrived from across the sea. A foreign religion called Buddhism showed up from Korea. The locals, who already had their own religion called Shinto, were not happy about it.
You can't just bring in a new god. We already have plenty.
But this one teaches you how to escape suffering.
I'm not suffering. You're making me suffer right now.
The fight nearly turned into a full civil war. Then Prince Shotoku, who was running the country because the emperor was very young at the time, made a weirdly chilled out decision. He just kept both religions. And it worked, because the two religions ended up doing completely different jobs. Shinto handled all the happy parts of life, like births, weddings, and shrines for good luck. Buddhism handled death and what came after. Nobody had to give up anything. Even today, most Japanese people are born Shinto and buried Buddhist. They use one religion for life and the other one for death. Shotoku also did something else. He wrote one of the cheekiest letters in the history of diplomacy. He sent it to the Emperor of China in the year 607.
From the Son of Heaven in the land where the sun rises, to the Son of Heaven in the land where the sun sets.
Never show me this letter again! It nearly started a war. Calling yourself a son of heaven was something only the Chinese emperor was supposed to do, but the Chinese decided a war wasn't worth the trouble. Japan was far away across the sea, and getting an army over there would be super expensive. The cheeky letter also showed Japan now had real organized power, not just random tribes. So after a bit of huffing, the Chinese started treating Japan as an equal, not as some backwater across the sea. And Shotoku gave the islands their first official name based on his cheeky letter, Nihon, which means the place where the sun comes from. For the first time, Japan officially existed as a country. There was just one problem. China, which at the time was called Tang Dynasty China, was the richest and most advanced empire on the entire planet. And next to that, the new little country of Nihon was looking a little basic. So Japan made a wild decision. It was going to copy China from top to bottom, every single thing it could possibly get its hands on. Tang Dynasty China was the New York of the ancient world, and Japan wanted it. There was just one problem. China was hundreds of miles away across some of the most dangerous open sea in the world. Over the next 200 years, Japan sent 21 official missions across to China. Look at this map. Every single ship had to cross right here, where the East China Sea is famous for swallowing ships whole. 1 in every 4 ships that made the trip didn't make it home. People drowned in storms, and whole expeditions could just vanish into the sea, never to be heard from again. The Japanese kept going anyway. Each mission sent scholars, monks, students, and artists, some of whom stayed in China for decades just to learn everything they could. And when those scholars finally came home, they copied everything. The writing system, the calendar, the legal code, the way streets were laid out in big cities. They even built a brand new capital called Nara, designed as a mini version of the Chinese capital, Chang'an, with neat grid-patterned streets meeting at perfect right angles. Look at this map. It's basically a tiny copy-paste of the original. Japanese officials even started dressing like Chinese government workers and reading Chinese poetry at parties to look posh. For a while, everything fashionable in Japan came from China. Their proudest project was a giant temple called Todaiji, the biggest wooden building in the entire world. Inside sat a bronze Buddha 15 meters tall, made from around 500 tons of bronze. To cast it, they used up almost all the bronze in the entire country. The whole project nearly bankrupted Japan. For the official opening ceremony in the year 752, they needed someone really special to paint in the Buddha's pupils. So they invited an Indian monk named Bodhisena. He had walked and sailed all the way from Tamil Nadu in southern India, through China and over to Japan. The journey took him years. Around 17,000 people came to watch him climb a ladder and paint 2 very tiny dots. They could barely see him do it. They didn't care. He had come further to paint those dots than most people in the crowd had ever traveled in their entire lives. By this point, the Buddhist temples had grown enormous. They owned vast amounts of land and gold from years of donations, and they basically started telling the emperor what to do. So the emperor did the only thing he could think of. He packed up the entire capital and moved everyone to a new city called Kyoto, just to get away from these annoying monks. And once everyone was settled in Kyoto, Japan suddenly stopped copying China. They felt like they had taken plenty already, and the Tang dynasty over there was starting to fall apart anyway. There wasn't much new learning worth it, and the deadly trips across the sea just weren't worth the risk anymore. The ships stopped sailing, and Japan turned completely inward. Then came something Japan invented entirely on its own. It was strange and beautiful, but completely useless for actually running a country. And hey, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to like and subscribe. These videos take a crazy amount of work to animate, and trust me, the story of Japan only gets crazier from here. For the next 300 years, while the rest of the world was busy conquering and burning each other's cities to the ground, the people running Japan did almost nothing. Quite literally nothing. The emperor was still officially in charge, but real power belonged to one specific family, the Fujiwara. Their strategy was simple. They got their daughters to marry every single emperor for 10 generations in a row. Every new emperor grew up surrounded by Fujiwara relatives who all told him exactly what to do. They ran the country from the in-laws' position. And what did the nobles in Kyoto do with all this peace and power? They got obsessed with looking pretty. Like, deeply obsessed. The fashionable noble outfit was 12 full layers of silk, all in different colors, layered carefully so the colors blended together perfectly at the sleeves. People would judge you on how nice the gradient looked when you stuck your arm out of a carriage window. They wrote poems about cherry blossoms and drank tea by candlelight. They even picked their romantic partners based entirely on the quality of their handwriting. Some of the most powerful men in Japan reportedly refused to date a woman if her brush strokes looked too thick. Imagine being dumped because your handwriting wasn't fancy enough.
Does this brush stroke look like longing to you?
It looks like you've been awake for 9 hours, sir.
But does it convey yearning?
It conveys a man who needs to go to bed.
Perfect. Send it.
While the nobles were busy comparing handwriting, one of them was secretly doing something nobody on Earth had ever done before. Her name was Murasaki Shikibu, and she was writing a novel. A massive, 1,000-page novel called The Tale of Genji, about love, jealousy, and politics inside the imperial court. It's considered the first real novel in the history of the world. She wrote it nearly 600 years before Shakespeare was even born. While most men in Europe were still mainly worried about not dying of plague, a woman in 12 layers of silk was quietly inventing the entire idea of long fiction. Outside the palace walls, though, the country was quietly falling apart. The Fujiwara nobles couldn't be bothered to do any of the boring stuff like collecting taxes or fighting off bandits, so they hired some tough local warriors to handle all that messy, real-life work for them. These hired warriors had a name. They were called the samurai. The samurai got really good at their jobs. They earned land and got rich. Before long, they had their own private armies. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the nobles were still inside comparing handwriting samples. The samurai had all the swords, the nobles had all the silk. Anyone want to guess how this ends? The nobles never stood a chance. The samurai swept them aside without much of a fight. But with nobody left to actually rule the country, the biggest samurai clans turned on each other to see who would run Japan. 2 enormous warrior clans, the Taira and the Minamoto, went to war for control. Look at this map. Their territories spread across the country like spilled paint, and wherever the 2 colors met, there was battle. After years of fighting, the Minamoto won. But the Minamoto leader did something nobody had ever tried before. Instead of taking the throne for himself, he invented a brand new job called the shogun. Basically, a military boss who actually ran the country while the emperor stayed locked safely in his palace, still being treated like a god. This weird setup with a useless god emperor at the top and a real boss carrying all the swords just below him stuck around for almost 700 years. Things were going pretty well for the shogun. Then a letter arrived from the scariest person alive on the planet. His name was Kublai Khan, ruler of the Mongol Empire. His grandfather, Genghis Khan, had conquered most of Asia. He himself had just finished conquering China, and now he wanted Japan to bow down too.
Submit to me or face my armies. Hello? Is anybody over there? Send another messenger. Did you receive my letters? We did. Your messengers will not be returned.
Japan executed his ambassadors. When Khan sent more ambassadors to find out what happened to the first ones, Japan executed those too. Then, they just sent their heads back just to make sure the message was understood clearly. Kublai Khan was understandably furious. He gathered the biggest invasion fleet in the entire history of the world, 4,400 ships, around 140,000 men. Nothing on this scale would even be attempted again until D-Day in 1944, almost 700 years later. The samurai built stone walls along Hakata Bay and held the beaches for weeks against impossible odds. It was a complete culture clash. The samurai were used to fighting polite one-on-one duels with formal introductions beforehand. The Mongols brought poison arrows and bombs, which the samurai had never seen in their lives. The Japanese should have lost, easily. But then, a typhoon hit overnight. It smashed most of the Mongol fleet into splinters. The few ships that survived limped home in total disgrace. 6 years later, Kublai tried again with an even bigger fleet, and you won't believe this. But another typhoon hit, another fleet destroyed. Kublai Khan never tried again. And out of every country in the entire world, Japan was the only one the Mongols ever failed to conquer. The Japanese gave those storms a name. They called them kamikaze, the divine wind. And they started believing, deeply and very seriously, that their islands were personally protected by the gods themselves. Hold on to that idea, because the kamikaze story is going to come roaring back in about 700 years in a very different form. But for now, peace in Japan was about to do what peace in Japan always does, end. By the 1400s, the whole shogun arrangement just stopped working. The regional warlords called daimyo simply stopped taking orders. Then they started fighting each other. Look at this map. Japan shattered into dozens of mini countries, each one with its own warlord and its own private army. The chaos had a name. It was called the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, and it went on for a full century. Out of all that mess, one of the most famous Japanese inventions in history finally appeared in real life: the ninja. And yes, ninja were absolutely real. They were professional spies and assassins hired by the warlords to handle the jobs that weren't considered honorable enough for samurai. Climbing castle walls in the dark, slipping poison into tea, listening through paper walls, disappearing in puffs of smoke. Some of the techniques in the old ninja training manuals are so detailed that modern soldiers still study them today. Hi-ya! Then, one day, Portuguese traders washed up on a tiny Japanese island called Tanegashima. They were carrying something Japan had never seen in its entire history: guns. The warlords took one look and immediately wanted them. Within 30 years, Japanese gunsmiths were producing better guns than the Europeans had brought in the first place. Out of all the chaos came the most famous warrior in Japanese history, a man named Miyamoto Musashi. He killed more than 60 men in one-on-one sword duels and never lost a single one of them. Musashi was also a brilliant poet and painter. In Japan, being a great warrior was only half the job. You were expected to be a complete person, master of both the sword and the brush. They called this code Bushido, the way of the warrior. But the chaos still needed someone to end it. 3 warlords took turns trying. The first one was Oda Nobunaga, a ruthless commander who got most of the way there before being betrayed and killed by one of his own generals. The second was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who finished the unification, then got bored and decided to invade Korea for fun and lost. The third was the most patient man in Japanese history, Tokugawa Ieyasu. His entire strategy was do nothing. Wait.
My lord, Hideyoshi is fighting a war in Korea. Should we join him?
No.
He'll be furious with us.
He'll be dead. We wait. And Hideyoshi did die. Then Tokugawa won one massive final battle at a palace called Sekigahara with around 200,000 men fighting on a single battlefield. By the end of the day, he had taken all of Japan for himself. After a full century of non-stop war, the new shogun was completely exhausted, and he was about to make one of the most radical decisions in the entire history of Japan. Tokugawa Ieyasu locked Japan up, completely. No foreigners allowed in, and no Japanese allowed out. Anyone caught trying either way got the death penalty, no exceptions. For everyone, for everything. He had his reasons. Spanish and Portuguese missionaries had been quietly converting Japanese peasants to Christianity, and Tokugawa was convinced that one day the Europeans would use those converts to invade Japan, the same way they had taken half of South America. So he just sealed the whole country shut. There was exactly one tiny little exception. The Dutch, for being polite and not pushing Christianity, were allowed to trade through one single artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor. See the map? The island, called Dejima, was about the size of a few football fields. That postage stamp-sized rock was Japan's only window to the rest of the entire world. And it stayed that way for 250 straight years. Every few years, the Dutch traders had to travel all the way to the shogun's court and perform humiliating tricks to amuse him. They had to dance for him and sing songs in Dutch. Sometimes he even made them pretend to be drunk. It was the price of staying in business. Inside the bubble, time basically froze. The samurai now had no wars to fight, so they slowly turned into government bureaucrats and amateur poets. People were stuck in whichever social class they had been born into for life. Born a fisherman, die a fisherman. Born a farmer, die a farmer. No moving up, no moving down. From the outside, it looked peaceful, even quite stable. But under the surface, the whole country was slowly rotting. Prices kept rising, famines kept hitting, sometimes killing hundreds of thousands of peasants. The merchants class was getting richer than the samurai, but had no real power in the old system. Resentment was building in every corner of the country. Meanwhile, the Dutch had been secretly smuggling in something very dangerous through Dejima. Books. Had you there for a second, didn't I?
This drawing, it shows what's actually inside the human body.
If anyone catches us with this, we're dead.
Then we'd better read faster.
A tiny secret network of Japanese scholars have been quietly studying Western science and medicine for decades, and even how their weapons worked. They translated Dutch medicine books word by word, often guessing what each term meant. They even dissected criminal corpses to see if the Dutch anatomy books were accurate. They were. The traditional Japanese maps of the human body had been wrong for over 1,000 years. Nobody important paid these scholars any attention, they were just nerds with banned books. Meanwhile, outside the bubble, the rest of the world had totally transformed. The Industrial Revolution had ripped through England, America had become a whole new country, and Napoleon had risen and fallen across Europe. Steam engines, factories, telegraphs, and repeating rifles had all been invented. Whole nations had been built and destroyed, and Japan, sealed inside its bubble, had no idea any of it was happening. Then, one morning in July 1853, 4 enormous black ships appeared in Tokyo Bay. Here, on this map. They had no sails, yet they were moving against the wind, breathing thick black smoke. Nobody in Japan had ever, in 250 years, seen anything like them. The ships were American. Their commander was a man called Matthew Perry. No, not the guy from Friends, another Matthew Perry. His message was super simple. Open your ports to American trade, or we will open them for you. Japan had absolutely nothing in its arsenal that could fight steam-powered warships, so they signed the treaty. The humiliation was total. The shogun, the most powerful man in Japan, looked weak and useless in front of the entire country. The samurai class, who were supposed to defend Japan from any outside threat, were super angry. A full rebellion broke out. For the first time in nearly 700 years, the shogun was overthrown. The rebels put a teenage emperor named Meiji back on the throne and gave him real power. The new government knew exactly what would happen if they didn't modernize fast. The Europeans had been gobbling up the rest of Asia for years, and Japan was clearly next on the menu unless something changed. They had to catch up to the modern world or vanish completely. So Japan did something no country in history had ever done before. It deliberately ripped its own civilization apart and rebuilt itself from scratch in just 40 years. Railways, factories, telegraph lines, a whole Western-style army, a modern constitution, a parliament, new schools teaching mathematics and physics. Look at this man. With one single generation, feudal Japan had become an industrial superpower. And remember those nerds? The secret scholars with the banned Dutch books? They were suddenly the most important people in the country. They were the ones who already knew how the modern world worked. They went straight from hiding in attics to running entire government departments. But there was a big price to pay. The samurai class itself was abolished by the law. They lost their swords and their wages overnight. Worst of all, they lost their whole reason for existing. Some of them rose up in one last doomed rebellion called the Satsuma Rebellion. They lost, of course. The new government had cannons and modern rifles. The samurai had swords. Many of the ones who survived couldn't handle the new world and quietly chose to end things on their own terms. An entire warrior class that had ruled Japan for almost 1,000 years simply disappeared. But here's the strange thing. Out of every Asian country, Japan was the only one that was never fully colonized by Europeans. China had been carved up by European powers, and India had become a full British possession. Most of Southeast Asia was under French or Dutch control too. Japan absorbed the European threat, copied everything useful from it, and turned that knowledge straight back into national fuel. And then, in 1905, Japan did something even more crazy. It went to war with Russia. Tiny, recently feudal little Japan against the giant Russian Empire that stretched all the way from Poland to the Pacific Ocean. As you can see on this map, Russia was huge. Nobody outside Japan thought they had a chance. But amazingly, they won. They sank most of the Russian fleet, then they took huge stretches of land in Manchuria, which, as you can see on this map, was in northeast China, and forced Russia to sign a peace treaty. It was the first time in modern history that an Asian country had defeated a European one. The entire world was completely, utterly stunned. Japan was starting to feel unstoppable, and that feeling was about to turn into something really, really dangerous. Japan kept winning, then it kept taking. First it took Taiwan, then it took Korea. After so many easy victories, the Japanese military had become really powerful and hugely popular at home. Plus, the way the government was set up, the army could speak directly to the emperor without going through any politicians. So the military just started ignoring the elected government and making its own decisions. There was no single dictator running the country, no Hitler or Stalin figure at the top. Anyone who tried to slow things down was assassinated. The whole nation just got steadily more aggressive every single year, and nobody, not even the emperor himself, could find the brakes. In 1931, Japanese soldiers secretly blew up their own railway in a Chinese region called Manchuria, and then blamed China for it. They used this fake attack as an excuse to invade. Look at this map. They set up a puppet state and called it Manchukuo. The rest of the world got upset. The League of Nations told Japan to stop, so Japan simply walked out of the League of Nations and kept going anyway. By 1937, Japan was invading the rest of China. In the city of Nanjing, Japanese troops killed an estimated 200,000 civilians and prisoners of war in just a few weeks. It was one of the worst atrocities in the entire 20th century. Then, in December 1941, during World War II, Japan did something that, even today, historians still struggle to explain. In one single day, it attacked the United States, the British Empire, and most of Southeast Asia all at once, starting with a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. They sank or damaged 18 American warships in a single morning. Within a few months, the Japanese Empire had ballooned all the way from the borders of India out to the middle of the Pacific Ocean. For half a year, they really did look unstoppable. Then, in June 1942, the Americans surprised them right back. In a sea battle near a tiny island called Midway, the US Navy sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in a single day. Japan never recovered. The Americans started pushing back island by island. Japanese cities were firebombed flat, whole neighborhoods turned to ash overnight, and the military, growing more desperate, invented a terrible new kind of warrior: kamikaze pilots. Young men, often only 18 or 19 years old, flew planes loaded with explosives straight into American warships. Around 4,000 of them died this way in the final year of the war. The divine wind, the kamikaze, that had saved Japan from the Mongols 700 years earlier, was being asked to save them one more time. But this time, the divine wind didn't come. In August 1945, the Americans dropped 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war ended a few days later. The emperor himself went on the national radio to announce the surrender. And what's crazy is that no Japanese person anywhere in the entire country had ever heard the emperor's voice before. Ever. He had been treated as a literal god for centuries. Gods don't do radio broadcasts. And when he finally did speak, he used such old, formal court language that most regular people couldn't actually understand the exact words he was saying. They just knew from the tone and the silence afterwards that it was over. In 1945, basically nobody on Earth thought Japan would ever matter again. Every single one of them was about to be very, very wrong. American forces occupied Japan and got straight to work. They wrote Japan a brand new constitution that literally banned the country from ever declaring war on anyone ever again. The emperor, who had been a literal god for over 1,000 years, was officially downgraded to a symbol. The country was both broke and broken, but for the first time in its entire history, it was also brand new. But the emperor's surrender speech had said something strange. The war, he said, had only moved to a different battlefield. The Japanese people took that idea completely literally. The old samurai code of total loyalty to your lord, the Bushido, survived the fall of the empire. It just changed jobs. A new kind of person appeared in Japan called the salaryman. Instead of armor and a sword, he wore a suit and carried a briefcase. But he gave his entire life to his company, working 16-hour days and never taking a vacation, exactly the same way a samurai had once given his entire life to his lord. It was the same loyalty in a different costume. And it worked. In less than 30 years after losing absolutely everything, Japan became the second biggest economy on the entire planet. Toyota, Honda, Sony, Nintendo, Mitsubishi, Japan invented the bullet train, the Walkman, and the home video game console. And basically all of modern anime came from Japan too. The country that had bombed Pearl Harbor was now politely selling America televisions, cars, and even Mario games. Japanese culture was suddenly everywhere. Sushi shops were popping up in every American city. Over in Hollywood, directors were remaking samurai films as westerns, and kids in Brazil and Germany were learning Japanese words from cartoons. A country that had been firebombed flat 30 years earlier was quietly conquering the world all over again, this time with cartoons and electronics. Then, in 1990, the whole thing popped. Land prices, which had been climbing crazily for years, crashed. Stock prices crashed. Some pieces of land in central Tokyo had been worth, on paper, more than the entire state of California. That kind of money simply vanished overnight. Japan entered what historians later called the Lost Decades. But what's really strange is that the trains kept running on time and the shops stayed open. People still went to work every day, and life in Japan kept on going. It just stopped growing. And now Japan is facing a brand new kind of problem, one that no country in human history has ever really faced before. The country is shrinking. Look at this map. Fewer babies are born in Japan every single year. There are now more Japanese people over 65 than under 15. Entire villages out in the countryside are being abandoned because there are simply not enough young people left to live in them. Engineers are now building robots to look after the elderly because there aren't enough humans to do that job. Soon, there will be more graveyards than schools. What's scary is almost every other major country on Earth is sliding into the exact same shrinking, aging problem that Japan is dealing with right now. Italy, South Korea, Germany, even China. They just don't know it yet. Japan got there first. The rest of the world is about to follow. Japan is quietly getting on with it, while everybody else pretends nothing is wrong. And now that you've seen the insane history of Japan, you kinda have to learn about the Mongols too. Because without the Mongol Empire, a huge part of Asian history stops making sense. Trust me, this story gets absolutely insane, so click here and watch that video next. I'll catch you next time.